Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. I hope you are very consistent and we all are improving through our consistency and regularity. So let's just start reading where we left. I always regarded the discussions about food as dangerous. Is it not wrong to provoke the organism with such detailed and effective pictures of delicacies when it has somehow managed to adapt itself to extremely small rations and low calories? Though it may afford momentary psychological relief, it is an illusion which psychologically surely must not be without danger. During the later part of our imprisonment, the daily ration consisted of very watery soup given out once daily, and the usual small bread ration. In addition to that, there was the so-called extra allowance consisting of three-fourths of an ounce of margarine or of a slice of poor quality sausage or of a little piece of cheese or a bit of synthetic honey or a spoonful of watery jam. Varying daily. In calories, this diet was absolutely inadequate, especially taking into consideration our heavy manual work and our constant exposure to the cold in inadequate clothing. The sick who were under special care, that is, those who were allowed to lie in the huts, insisted of leaving the camp for work, were even worse off. When the last layers of subcutaneous fat had vanished, subcutaneous fat had vanished and we looked like skeletons disguised with skin and rags, we could watch our bodies beginning to devour themselves. The organism digested its own protein and the muscles disappeared. Then the body had no powers of resistance left. One after another, the members of the little community in our herd died. Each of us could calculate with fair accuracy whose turn would be next, and when his own would come. After many observations, we knew the symptoms well, which made the correctness of our prognosis quite certain. He won't last long, or this is the next one. We whispered to each other, and when during our daily search for lice we saw our own naked bodies in the evening, we thought aloud. This body here, my body, is really a corpse already. What has become of me? I am but a small portion of a great mass of human flesh, of a mass behind barbed wire, crowded into a few earthen herds, a mass of which daily a certain portion begins to rot because it has become lifeless. I mentioned above how unavoidable were the thoughts about food and favorite dishes which forced themselves into the consciousness of the prisoner whenever he had a moment to spare. Perhaps it can be understood then that even the strongest of us was longing for the time when he would have fairly good food again, not for the sake of good food itself, but for the sake of knowing that the subhuman existence which had made us unable to think of anything other than food would at last cease. Those who have not gone through a similar experience can hardly conceive of the soul destroying mental conflict and clashes of willpower which a famished man experiences. They can hardly grasp what it means to stand digging in a trench, listening only for the siren to announce 9:30 or 10 a.m., the half-hour lunch interval, when bread would be rationed out, as long as it was still available, repeatedly asking the foreman if he wasn't a disagreeable fellow, what the time was, and tenderly touching a piece of bread in one's coat pocket. First stroking it with frozen gloveless fingers, then breaking off a crumb and putting it in one's mouth, and finally, with the last bit of willpower, pocketing it again, having promised oneself that morning to hold out till afternoon. We could hold endless debates on the sense or nonsense of certain methods of dealing with the small bread ration, which was given out only once daily during the later part of our confinement. There were two schools of thought. One was in favor of eating up the ration immediately. This had the twofold advantage of satisfying the worst hunger pangs for a very short time, at least once a day, and of safeguarding at least once a day and of safeguarding against possible theft or loss of the ration. The second group, which held with dividing the ration up, used different arguments. I finally joined their ranks. The most ghastly movement of the 24 hours of camp life was the awakening when, at a still nocturnal the three shrill blows of a whistle tore us pitilessly from our exhausted sleep and from the longings in our dream. We then began the tussle with our wet shoes, into which we could scarcely force our feet, which were sore and swollen with edema, and there were the usual moans and groans about petty troubles, such as the snapping of wires which replaced shoelaces. One morning I heard someone whom I knew to be brave and dignified cry like a child because he finally had to go to the snowy marching grounds in his bare feet, as his shoes were too shrunken for him to wear. In those ghastly minutes I found a little bit of comfort, a small piece of bread which I drew out of my pocket and munched with absorbed delight. Undernourishment, besides being the cause of general preoccupation with food, probably also explains the fact that the sexual urge was generally absent. Apart from the initial effects of shock, this appears to be the only explanation of a phenomenon which a psychologist was bound to observe in those all male camps, that as opposed to all other strictly male establishments such as army barracks, there was little sexual perversion. Even in his dream, the prisoner did not seem to concern himself with sex, although his frustrated emotions and his finer, higher feelings did find definite expression in them. With the majority of the prisoners, the primitive life and the effort of having to concentrate on just saving one's skin led to a total disregard of anything not serving that purpose, and explained the prisoner's complete lack of sentiment. This was brought home to me on my transfer from Auschwitz to a camp affiliated with Dachau. The train which carried us, about 2,000 prisoners, passed through Vienna. At about midnight we passed one of the Viennese railway stations. The track was going to lead us past the street where I was born, past the house where I had lived many years of my life, in fact until I was taken prisoner. There were 50 of us in the prison car, which had two small barred peepholes. There was only enough room for one group to squat on the floor, while the others, who had to stand up for hours, crowded round the peepholes, standing on tiptoe and looking past the other's head through the bars of the window. I caught an airy glimpse of my native town. We all felt more dead than alive. Since we thought that our transport was heading for the camp at Mauthausen and that we had only 1 or 2 weeks to live, I had a distinct feeling that I saw the streets, the squares, and the houses of my childhood with the eyes of a dead man who had come back from another world and was looking down on a ghostly city. After hours of delay the train left the station, and there was the street, my street. The young lads who had a number of years of camp life behind them, and for whom such a journey was a great event, stared attentively through the peephole. I began to beg them, to entreat them, to let me stand in front for one moment only. I tried to explain how much a look through that window meant to me just then. My request was refused with rudeness and cynicism. You lived here all those years. Well, then you have seen quite enough already. In general, there was also a cultural hibernation in the camp. There were two exceptions to this: politics and religion. Politics were talked about everywhere in camp, almost continuously. The discussions were based chiefly on rumors, which were snapped up and passed around avidly. The rumors about the military situation were usually contradictory. They followed one another rapidly and succeeded only in making a contribution to the war of nerves that was vague in the minds of all the prisoners. Many times, hopes for a speedy end to the war, which had been fanned by optimistic rumors, were disappointed. Some men lost all hope, but it was the incorrigible optimists who were the most irritating companions. The religious interest of the prisoners, as far and as soon as it developed, was the most sincere imaginable. The depth and vigor of religious belief often surprised and moved a new arrival. Most impressive in the connection were improvised prayers or services in the corner of a hut or in the darkness of the locked cattle truck in which we were brought back from a distant work site, tired, hungry, and frozen in our ragged clothing. In the winter and spring of 1945, there was an outbreak of typhus which infected nearly all the prisoners. The mortality was great among the weak, who had to keep on with their hard work as long as they possibly could. The quarters for the sick were most inadequate. There were practically no medicines. There were practically no medicines or attendants. Some of the symptoms of the disease were extremely disagreeable and irresponsive and irrepressible aversion to even a scrap of food, which was an additional danger to life, and terrible attacks of delirium. The worst case was delirium, was suffered by a friend of mine who thought that he was dying and wanted to pray. In his delirium, he could not find the words to do so. To avoid these attacks of delirium, I tried, as did many of the others, to keep awake for most of the night. For hours I composed speeches in my mind. Eventually I began to reconstruct the manuscript which I had lost in the disinfection chamber of Auschwitz and scribbled the key words in shorthand on tiny scraps of paper. Occasionally, I occasionally a scientific debate developed in camp. Once I witnessed something I had never seen, even in my normal life. Although it lay somewhat near my own professional interest, a spiritualistic science I had been invited to attend by the camp's chief doctor, also a prisoner who knew that I was a specialist in psychiatry. The meeting took place in his small private room in the sick quarters. A small circle had gathered, among them quite illegally the war rent officer from the sanitation squad. One man began to invoke the spirits with a kind of prayer. The camp's clerk sat in front of a blank sheet of paper, without any conscious intention of writing. During the next 10 minutes, after which time the seance was terminated because of the medium's failure to conjure the spirits to appear, his pencil slowly drew lines across the paper, forming quite legibly VAEV. It was asserted that the clerk had never learned Latin, and that he had never before heard the words "Vae victis," woe to the vanquished. In my opinion, he must have heard them once in his life without recollecting them, and they must have been available to the spirit of his subconscious mind, at that time, a few months before our liberation and the end of the war. In spite of all the enforced physical and mental primitiveness of the life in a concentration camp, it was possible for spiritual life to deepen. Sensitive people who were used to a rich intellectual life may have suffered much pain. They were often of a delicate constitution, but the damage to their inner selves was less. They were able to retreat from their terrible surroundings to a life of inner riches and spiritual freedom. Only in this way we can one explain only in this way can one explain the apparent paradox that some prisoners of a less hardy makeup often seem to survive camp life better than did those of a robust nature. In order to make myself clear, I am forced to fall back on a personal experience. Let me tell what happened on those early mornings when we had to march to our work site. There were shouted commands: detachment forward, march, left 234, left 234, left 234, left 234. First man about, left and left, caps off. These words sound in my ears even now. At the order, caps off, we passed the gate of the camp and searchlights were trained upon us. Whoever did not march smartly got a kick, and Warsaw was the man who, because of the cold, had pulled his cap back over his ear before permission was given. We stumbled on his darkness. We stumbled on in the darkness over big stones and through large puddles along the one road leading from the camp. The accompanying guards kept shouting at us and driving us with the butts of their rifles. Anyone with very sore feet supported himself on his neighbor's arm. Hardly a word was spoken. The icy wind did not encourage talk. Hiding his mouth behind his upturned collar, the man marching next to me whispered suddenly, "If our wives could see us now, I do hope they are better off in their camps and don't know what is happening to us." That brought thoughts of my own wife to mind, and as we stumbled on for miles, slipping on icy spots, supporting each other time and again, dragging one another up and onward, nothing was said, but we both knew. Each of us was thinking of his wife. Occasionally, I looked at the sky where the stars were fading and the pink light of the morning was beginning to spread behind a dark bank of clouds. But my mind clung to my wife's image, imagining it with an uncanny acuteness. I heard her answering me, saw her smile, her frank and encouraging look. Real or not, her look was then more luminous than the sun which was beginning to rise. A thought transfixed me. For the first time in my life, I saw the truth as it is, set into song by so many poets, proclaimed as the final wisdom by so many thinkers. The truth that love is the ultimate and the highest goal to which men can aspire. Then I grasped the meaning of the greatest secret that human poetry and human thought and belief have to impart. The salvation of man is through love, and in love. I understood how a man who has nothing left in this world still may know bliss, be it only for a brief moment, in the contemplation of his beloved. In a position of utter desolation, when man cannot express himself in positive action, when his only achievement may consist in enduring his sufferings in the right way, an honorable way, in such a position, man can, through loving contemplation of the image he carries of his beloved, achieve fulfillment. For the first time in my life, I was able to understand the meaning of the words, "The angels are lost in perpetual contemplation of an infinite glory." In front of me, a man stumbled, and those following him fell on top of him. The guard rushed over and used his whip on them all. Thus my thoughts were interrupted for a few minutes, but soon my soul found its way back from the prisoner's existence to another world, and I resumed talk with my loved one. I asked her questions, and she answered. She questioned me in return, and I answered. Stop! We had arrived at a work site. Everybody rushed into the dark hut in the hope of getting a fairly decent tool. Each prisoner got a spade or a pickaxe. Can't you hurry up, you pigs? Soon we had resumed the previous day's position in the ditch. The frozen ground cracked under the point of the pickaxes, and sparks flew. The men were silent, their brains numb. My mind still clung to the image of my wife. A thought crossed my mind. I didn't even know if she was still alive. I knew only one thing, which I have learned well by now. Love goes very far beyond the physical person of the beloved. It finds its deepest meaning in his spiritual being, his inner self, whether or not he is actually present, whether or not he is still alive at all, ceases somehow to be of importance. I did not know whether my wife was alive, and I had no means of finding out. During all my prison life, there was no outgoing or incoming mail. But at that moment, it ceased to matter. There was no need for me to know. Nothing could touch the strength of my love, my thoughts, and the image of my beloved. Had I known then that my wife was dead, I think that I would still have given myself undisturbed by that knowledge to the contemplation of her image, and that my mental conversation with her would have been just as vivid and just as satisfying. Set me like a seal upon thy heart. Love is as strong as death. Thank you, everyone. We will continue from here in the next video. Stay tuned.